Welcome back. So today is Earth Day, and it comes as President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on developed countries to meet their responsibility to developing countries. He was addressing the virtual White House Leaders Summit on climate that is bringing together 40 world leaders, and we'll have more on that live from the US a little bit later on. But what does this day mean for African economies? To discuss, we're joined now by Ghaamid Abdul Basat, who is Earth Day coordinator in Tanzania. Mr. Basat, thank you so much for being with us. Just give us a little bit of the background to Earth Day, and then also, how would you describe the state of the Earth right now?
Okay, so Earth Day, simply, it started as a movement in Washington, D.C. in 1970 by Dennis Hayes. So the climate strike was actually due to the air pollution, which was actually so excessive in the state of Washington. So the climate strike was actually to raise voices and to build a momentum to combat the impacts of climate change, because air pollution impacts were actually being faced by the people in DC and the United States. And the movement has now grown to Africa, and actually is commemorating its 51st anniversary today. And our program in Africa actually is based on environmental advocacy, and the main aim is trying to build the climate literacy from the young ones, as well as the citizen science programs and youth mobilization in terms of creating awareness and capacity building, and people to imagine the future in a way that also the economy can be affected by the impacts of climate change.
And for someone who works in this field, I mean, for you, does it feel like we're possibly staring into the abyss, like we need to change things now, or climate change could be catastrophic? Do you feel the weight of it right now?
Yeah, actually, they say, or we can say that we're actually so late right now, and we actually need to act right now. So the main point is because we're actually facing the impacts of climate change right now, including floods, droughts. We're having extreme events of heat stress, and so many more of extreme events, which are basically affecting our health, our economy, and our sustainability for the future.
A big change has been the change in the administration in the United States. So the new President Joe Biden re-entering the Paris Accord, committing to bring down emissions. Is that huge? Is that going to change things, given the trajectory that the US was on previously?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very huge, because we are speaking of the United States and President Biden joining the Paris Accord, because they were actually not there, and they were actually the main polluters in terms of industrial pollution. So this is a big thing for the world, because they were the main polluters, among the top polluters, followed by the Chinese. So this is actually very huge in terms of political negotiations, and it's a congratulations to President Biden and bringing together all the world leaders on the summit and discussing how the policies can be implemented in terms of climate and environment sustainability.
And let's look at what our own president has been saying, Cyril Ramaphosa, that developed nations must meet their obligations to developing nations. And I guess the idea has always been that the big industrialized nations are the big emitters, but the smaller countries, many of them in Africa, the smaller economies, are bearing the brunt of climate change. What are those obligations? What should be happening, and what is not happening?
So actually, what is not happening is the implementation. Ramaphosa stated on the principle of the United Nations framework on climate change, which states the principle of common but differentiated principles. Like people need to act, or the countries need to act according to the level of emissions they are producing in their countries. So I like the way he addressed in terms of focusing on developing an updated nationally determined contribution plan for Southern Africa in terms of climate change, by considering the vulnerable communities, which are actually mainly impacted by the impacts of climate change, and finding the means of financing mechanisms, as well as bringing up technology and capacity building in terms of developing our nations. And just to add on that, even the president of Tanzania today addressed the nation and stated that President Samia stated that they are developing also a 5-year plan from 2021 on national determined contributions on climate change. So I think right now we are on a state of optimism in terms of combating the impacts of climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa.
And you're talking about these contributions. This is what countries sort of pledge as their contribution to the effort, what they're going to do to bring about emissions. Can't we as Africa say, let those contributions be smaller because we haven't been the big emitters in the past? Are those sort of things considered?
Yeah, I think that's where the point which I mentioned on the common but differentiated principle comes in, because we Africans have the Africa Group of Negotiators under the Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework on Climate Change. So this basically looks into the ways we can be able to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. But again, acting accordingly, because we are not the main emitters, basically. We are the carbon absorbers, speaking of Africa. So we are trying to lob policies to the main producers of carbon emissions and see the way forward on how we can be able to act accordingly to the common but differentiated principle, meaning the states or the Chinese need to act more in terms of technological or political wills in industrialization.
And can you explain that for the uninitiated? How would it actually work, this differentiated stance? So you have different contributions, and should the developed world be paying for the effects of climate change in smaller countries?
Yeah, so actually back to the negotiations back in the Conference of Parties in 2015 in Paris. Their main aim was to reduce the temperature to the average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But again, in terms of contribution, it has shown that the main emitters were the top guys in the US and the Chinese and the others. But in terms of acting, they have been acting differently. We all know the previous regime of the United States, the way they kicked out the Paris Agreement in terms of implementing it. But again, I think we are optimistic because they need to act more. Because they simply produce more, and they need to finance more in terms of climate and biodiversity financing to see on how we can be able to mitigate, curb, and adapt to the impacts of climate change.
Yeah. And what are the big issues, one or two, that African countries should be thinking about this Earth Day, finally?
The big issues is to create spaces and platforms for the young ones, as well as the non-profits who are actually daily acting with stakeholders in terms of raising awareness on the impacts of climate change, trying the best to lobby on the climate literacy programs from nursery levels to high schools and university levels, to see on how we can integrate these policies of climate change adaptation and mitigation. I think this, for the policymakers in Africa, if we're able to implement this, then we are on a good or the right track, because environment determines the sustainability of economy, political and social sustainability.
All right. Thank you so much, Ghaamid Abdul Basat, Earth Day coordinator from Tanzania.